Hello, and welcome to Let's Talk Tax, the show for growth-minded CPAs and real estate pros in tax. I'm Justin Gephart. In today's episode, we will discuss site selection and the key considerations for growth project location decisions. Joining us today on Let's Talk Tax is Ben Worrell. Ben is a principal in McGuire Sponsel's location advisory services practices, specializing in site selection and credits and incentives compliance. Welcome, Ben.
Thanks, Justin.
You know, this big topic, site selection. Okay, we hear the word, it's a common phrase thrown around in the location advisory perspective. What does that actually mean?
Site selection starts off when you have a company that says, hey, we know we need to be somewhere else. Maybe that's just an expansion project, right? Maybe that's a totally new location. Maybe it's a startup business that's looking for its first location. So anytime someone is having those considerations that they need to be in a new location, that really can start off that site selection process. And it doesn't just have to be the Amazons of the world, right? That's when we were kind of introduced, the world was introduced to this site selection, or it came home to the living room, I like to say. Site selection can happen with everyday businesses that's out there, but it really starts with asking some key questions about what is going to catalyze us to be able to go to one location versus another.
And as companies look at something like that, what are some of the factors they're wanting to check into?
So those key drivers can be pretty myriad for a lot of different companies. Sometimes it may be specific to the workforce. Is there a specific skill set that someone's looking for, and therefore they need to locate next to maybe a community college or a state college that's going to be producing that type of skill set for them? Sometimes it's going to be utility related. Is there a particular type of utility or a specific rate that they're looking for that may dictate, okay, the northern half of the country may not be as beneficial for that project as going to the southern half of the country if they need to look at a lower, cheaper electrical rate, for example. Other factors that may come into there at some point in time are going to be associated with, is there available land to it? We know in some areas of the country, the topography could be a challenge for them. So if they need 100 acres of flat ground to build on, then it may be a challenge for them if they are trying to look inside of a Rocky Mountain area versus the Appalachian Mountains.
Well, Ben, we've done a number of podcasts together. It's probably the fastest we've ever started to peel those onion layers back. I mean, we dove right into it.
That's right.
So I appreciate you jumping in. You know, the thing about on the site selection side, you started to talk about the utilities, okay? We're starting to hear more and more about some of the problems that some of the states are starting to go to. Can you hit on what are a couple of those metrics? What are areas that maybe states wanted to attract 3-4 years ago versus what they're trying to steer away from because of some of those infrastructure issues?
Yeah, I've actually had some interesting conversations with utility providers here recently, especially on the electricity side. And one of the comments was, you know, we've had a surplus of electricity for a long time. But then with the advent, some of these new industries that are starting to come in, things like data centers, things like the EV battery industry, and all of the power support that's required to make those things happen, have very quickly sucked up that surplus of energy that was sitting out there creating energy, keeping energy cheap for a while too. As you've also started to see a lot of those companies kind of convert over into either clean or green energy initiatives, moving more towards solar, maybe wind farms, and away from coal-fired power plants, moving towards natural gas and things like that. That's just drastically shifted the industry that's out there. And so now when they were sitting with a surplus of power, now all of a sudden it's dramatically reduced, and these timelines to get projects done, which is another factor that we're talking with clients about in their site selection process. When do you need to be operational? Marrying that up with where is there available utilities and all those available inputs to when they need to be operational has proven challenging.
And one of the other areas we're seeing along the infrastructure side is the water issue. Sitting here in Indianapolis today, there's a big controversy in the central Indiana. You know, there's a big LEAP district that they're wanting to develop, and water is a key component to that. It's not just relevant to Indiana, though. We're seeing that conversation in a lot of different states across the country. And I think one of the interesting pieces is how are states going to adapt to that need and that threshold, because there's a lot of industries that are still trying to tap into these areas. So I think you've hit on the electrical piece. There's the water side. And then I think the third piece that we're seeing is on the labor side, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, workforce is key, right? You can't run a business without having the people there inside of it. So how do we find those people? Where do we need to be? Is there a surplus of people? For a long time in the economy that we had, especially recently after COVID, that unemployment rate has been pretty low, honestly. So that means that the pool of workers that you're able to draw from is thin in a lot of areas. So a lot of communities are starting to say, just outside of wanting to attract those traditional economic development projects, your manufacturing, your distribution, your headquarters, research and development, they're actually pivoting a lot more of their focus now towards who's going to build multifamily for us, who's going to build additional housing, because we've got to attract more people to this area. And as you're seeing some of those migration patterns of maybe individuals that are coming from some of the coasts more towards the interior or towards the Sunbelt states, there's a real challenge to be able to meet the demand of people moving into the community and have a variety of housing options too. So totally different site selection conversation at that point in time.
So what you're saying, you're seeing the housing issue. That's a pretty relevant issue across the country.
Absolutely, it is everywhere. I mean, one of the interesting statistics that's been out there too is that it's in some of these site selection discussions, it's not necessarily the CEO that's making decisions. It may actually be the spouse and where they want their kids to go to school. And so sometimes that's going to influence, just another one of those, the multiplicity of factors that come into site selection discussion is, what are some of the amenities to the community? Do we want to be there? And so that makes it a real challenge, both from our side, from a site selection standpoint, but also from community standpoints of how do we meet all of these different factors? Well, the fact of the matter is that those individual communities need to be able to say, here's what we are, here's where we can grow and where we can be. Some of those kind of internal looking conversations to say, who do we want to be in the marketplace? And then ultimately, who do we want to attract? Because we can't be everything for everyone.
Well, and as you indicated, states are getting a little bit more creative around incentivizing the residential development.
Mm-hmm.
Developers, to aid in that housing, are putting projects together that are more closely resemble what the residential life looks like,
meeting those
in
needs.
Korea.
Yeah,
that way they feel a little bit more at home.
Mm-hmm.
The units are a little bit smaller than what maybe some of the normal American developments are.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's cool to see developers maybe switch their mindset and say, okay, how do we make these people that are coming in state to help fill the job needs, how do we help make them feel a little bit more comfortable?
And then the communities are also trying to balance okay, we're not going to incentivize everything that's out there. So what are some of those plus factors that are being brought to the table? For multifamily development, for example, if you have amenities like a dog park or green spaces or public art, oftentimes those are requirements now, not just good recommendations or that we want to see this happen. It's you need to be doing these things if you want to be able to even tap into our incentive programs. And so you've got to be able to bring that to the table, which creates a unique balance, right? Because now all of a sudden you've got space that's not necessarily what we'll call revenue producing space. If I can't maximize the square footage that's there as rentable space, I've now got to allocate a certain portion of it, 5-10%, to these amenity type things. How does that impact the pro forma of that new development that's going in? And ultimately, we can help weave that conversation in with that community to say, look, here's what we'd like to do to make this a more desirable place to attract the workforce that you're looking for. So how do we offset some of those costs because this is now non-revenue producing space for us?
Which in turn, that conversation starts to turn towards, I think about some of the residents and, hey, they're just throwing money away at these companies. Well, those residents coming to that area, they're driving payroll tax dollars. Mm-hmm. The company's driving personal property tax, sometimes real property tax dollars into those communities.
Yeah,
100%. One of the other things that there's the residential piece of it, but then there's the child care aspect. It's another hot topic that we've heard throughout many, many local economic conversations.
Absolutely it is. And some of those incentives are starting to say, hey, how can you then bring a solution? You, the folks that are asking for these incentives, how can you help bring that to the table, bring a solution to the table? Maybe that's a stipend per employee. Maybe that's something where they actually have childcare on site, which is really important to a lot of folks, especially dual income households that have to have that support. So those can sometimes be an influencing factor for if that particular development can get incentives.
So Ben, over the last 2 years, we've had many more conversations with clients from states that we had not really worked with in the past, mainly because they were pretty limited on the economic incentive side. We're seeing some of those companies wanting to relocate or expand their operations into other states. Are there some factors that are really driving that initiative? Is it tax strategy?
Yeah, sometimes even just the political affiliation can change, right? We're in a political season right now. We've got a pretty important election that's coming up here very shortly, and that's obviously going to trickle down into the state and local level as well. So new initiatives are coming up all the time. A lot of states will look at each other, though, from a site selection standpoint and say, how are we how are we landing projects? Are we landing projects? How's that compare to our neighbors that are out there? And can we be doing something better that they're doing better because they're winning more projects at the end of the day? So it's kind of a good thing. You want a competitive workspace that's out there where you're attracting and at least competing for these types of projects as they come through. How that lands at the end of the day from the particulars of those programs that are out there, it's varied. So we always want to see kind of what has trended well. You mentioned the states that we've looked at before that maybe haven't trended as well beforehand. I think they're starting to take a look at their tools in the toolbox, as I like to say, and say, okay, well, we don't have those right now. What do we need to be doing from a legislative standpoint to be able to bring those in-house?
As we look at some of the states that have grown in popularity from an incentive standpoint, okay, we look at the Southeast states. They typically are at the top of the list year in, year out of some of the best places to start or grow a business. What are the tools and resources that they've used in the toolbox, to kind of steal your analogy there, that they use over and over and over to attract that business?
It's interesting because sometimes it is direct inputs. So it may be tax structure that's out there, and so they're having low costs for businesses. The tax structure is very simple, or it's easier to understand. It's just there's a low barrier to entry to be able to start up a business and continue it on there. Sometimes it's property tax related, so they're doing amendments to how they look at property taxes. Maybe they don't charge tangible business personal property tax. But then sometimes there's also those intangibles. It's Sunbelt states. People want to be there because there's less of the winter time that they have to deal with. So they've got kind of those natural advantages too, to where people say, hey, if we need to relocate, I'd really like to be over here because there's just a better opportunity for me and my family to be in those areas, and we're just going to have a higher quality of life at that point in time. Now it's starting to drive up the costs in those areas, which is one of the other things that was it was lower cost beforehand. So now we're starting to see some of those areas change, especially within metropolitan areas.
Perfect. So we've gone over the domestic changes. Let's hit on the international real quick as we start to close this down. We've seen a significant uptick in inbound discussions from Brazil, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, China. What are the obstacles that we've seen right now? We've talked about some of the state issues, but we also have to realize that there is federal pressure on some of these states with some of these countries. What are some of those issues? But then what are some of the issues just from a bear? I'm thinking about, the length of construction, the process of actually buying land. What are some of those developments that we have to work through our clients with when we talk about site selection specifically?
Yeah, I think the key on that one is the expectation of timeline, right? Because in some of these other countries, maybe that timeline would be much shorter. There's maybe less bureaucracy to go through because it's just a little more streamlined from the top down. Whereas here in the United States, we've got things like, what is a county council? What is a city council? What's the difference between the two of those, and why do I have to go through a drainage board or a zoning and variance thing? Why can't we found ground? Why can't we just start construction? So oftentimes that is an education piece that we have to introduce to clients if they aren't familiar with that already. It's where we like to work with referral partners such as industrial real estate brokers that can really help to navigate that, find the best site, maybe that also has some of those key features in place. We use a term in site selection called shovel ready. And that oftentimes means that utilities are already at the site. It's pad ready, i.e. the trees have been cleared and things like that. It's ready to go for future development. There may be an agricultural product that's out there right now, but it can very quickly be turned over into a new use. Zoning process may also already be in place to say, we the community have said we want to see this as a future industrial park that's out here. So we've already zoned it, so you don't have to worry about a lot of those snag issues that may trip up that timeline.
Ben, I appreciate your time today. We've covered a lot of ground. At the end of the day, site selection, it's wide encompassing. There are a lot of variables at play, and that's why it's important to tackle it in a very efficient manner. You have the political pressures from state to state. Obviously, we'll be paying attention to that as we close out 2024. It's going to be an interesting time to see how the landscape shifts from here on out. So thank you again for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for tuning in today. Remember to subscribe to @Let's Talk Tax podcast channel on YouTube to be notified and receive all new episodes. In addition, we invite you to visit us online at McGuireSponsel.com/Let's Talk Tax podcast to see today's show notes, technical resources, and links to more about today's content.